So, hello, my name is Natalie, and my presentation is on gender performance and transition in Sumer in connection to Inanna. So, during the discussion of transgender people existing throughout history, there seem to be two extremes that crop up and perhaps dominate the conversation. The first being that trans people never existed in history, much less in ancient civilizations, and are a modern invention. And the second being that trans people were widely accepted in ancient civilizations and that transphobia only heightened in the past couple of hundred years. I'm aware that it is near impossible to truly know if people who are trans existed in a time period and location for which we are still figuring out the language and history, but after analyzing relevant sources, I assert that transgender people existed and possibly lived as themselves in ancient Sumer. I also have found transgender people in that time period to be distinctly linked to the Sumerian goddess Inanna. I would like to also first clarify that when I will be saying transgender, it will be as an umbrella term for transgender, non-binary, and gender non-conforming people. In other words, people who present and live as a gender they were not assigned at birth, as there really is no word currently known to exactly describe people in history that we, looking back from the modern age, perceive as trans. Sumer was a part of ancient Mesopotamia, located in modern-day Iraq and Kuwait, as seen on the maps. And while it's not entirely clear when it began to be inhabited by Sumerians, it is estimated to be around 3000 BCE, as evidenced by the King's List. The King's List being a cuneiform tablet written around 2100 BCE that provided a chronological transcription of all the rulers of Sumers and their reigns. So it gives historians a rough image of when Sumer began to develop as an organized state, as well as when major cities formed. This includes the city of Uruk, which, like most Sumerian cities, was dedicated to certain deities, and Uruk was partially dedicated to Inanna, who served as a protector of the city. Rituals and rites were heavily conducted in Sumer in the honor of all the gods. However, those that had to do with Inanna were unique in their contents, as Inanna was unique as a goddess. Many accounts narrow her down as a goddess of love and fertility, not dissimilar to Aphrodite or Venus, but this view of her is oversimplified. Inanna represented inner and outer struggle and strife, the constant tumultuous relationship one has with their deepest emotions. According to historian Rivka Harris, Inanna was a paradox and embodied within herself polarities and contraries and thereby transcended them. In addition to this emotional aspect, she was used as a way to envision and explain conflicts, eliminating strife as an abstract principle, and usually only appeared in connection to Enki, god of order. And so her established face of strife and chaos is often juxtaposed in mythology with the god of the complete opposite of what she represents. One example of the multifaceted nature of Inanna appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where she is both maternally gentle and aggressively vengeful, possessing naivety concerning sexuality in one place and hypersexuality in another. The example of Inanna's ambiguousness and air of liminality that lends light to the subject of gender transition, however, appears in a hymn by a high priestess of Inanna, Enheduanna, who also is considered to be one of the first authors in history due to her work in cuneiform. In her exaltation in Ninsagura, often translated as passionate Inanna, she to run, to escape, to quiet, and to pacify are yours, Inanna. To destroy, to build up, to tear up, and to settle are yours, Inanna. To turn a man into a woman and a woman into a man are yours, Inanna. In addition to demonstrating the goddess's tendency towards contradiction, the last line in particular raises questions about possible gender transition in Sumer. How literal was Enheduanna? Did she mean this as metaphor and grand hyperbole, or was this something incorporated into the worship of Inanna? Did she herself engage in these activities? These are the questions I've kept in mind when searching for evidence of gender performance and transition in Sumer. As I mentioned earlier, religious rituals conducted in honor of Inanna included certain figures and motifs that I argue parallel experiences of transgender people in more modern times. One such figure was the Gala. In a summarized definition, this was a temple worker and singer of lamentations, and was involved in official musical performances having to do with both cultic and royal spheres. They most commonly worked in the temples of Inanna, singing balogs and ersemas in a Sumerian dialect called emisal. Historians disagree on the purpose of emisal, and even on the definition of the word, with definitions including a form of speech for women, a discrete women's language, effeminate speech, a South Sumerian dialect, or a fine or thin language. However, most definitions include the mention of emisal being exclusive or mostly used by women. Much of the disagreement comes from the lack of concrete translation of the word. Eme means tongue or speech, but Sol has been translated in various ways ranging from woman to salt of fine taste. Nevertheless, this dialect appears in literary texts exclusively when spoken by goddesses and women, and it appears that Gala, by all account biological males, would speak it as well, in lamentations and prayers, but also sometimes in day-to-day speech. One of the most popular explanations of why Gala spoke Emesal, at least amongst early European Assyriologists, was proposed by French archaeologist Alot de la Feuille in 1921. He argued that Galas were eunuchs, castrated in order to produce a more feminine voice for the lamentations and adorations, but ultimately remaining male. However, there really is no evidence of castration occurring for Galas, regardless of this popular explanation that persists today. Another rationale offered as to why a class of males would use a female dialect was that there were female priestesses working in temples of Inanna as well. However, there is not much known about them other than their existence, and due to the fact that these female priestesses worked in conjunction with Galas, makes it less likely that the latter would have picked up Emesal as a substitution for the priestesses. Therefore, I assert that the usage of the Emesal genderlect by Galas points towards some form of gender transition, or at least a form of gender change for these quote-unquote male historical figures. I would also like to briefly discuss two other classes of Inanna cultists that point in the direction of gender fluidity, the Galator and the Kurgara. Galator roughly translates to low-ranking Gala, and most likely performed duties similar to a Gala, while more distinctly, Kurgara performed as ritual dancers, reenacting stories of Inanna. Historian Will Roscoe suggests that Galas and Kurgara represented, respectively, the feminine and masculine aspects of Inanna, and while the Gala had the stated purpose of soothing the mind of the goddess with lamentations and other such musical ventures, the Kurgara had the function of, as Roscoe put it, provoking divine fury in the form of ritual chaos and resolving it. These rituals were rather violent, involving bloodletting, and possibly were performed in a trance-like state. If the Gala strove to honor Inanna in a lyrical capacity, the Kurgara strove to chase away evil by demonstrating an aggressiveness reflective of the goddess's own state. The point might be raised that all of the actions and described appearances of the Galator, and the Kurgara are merely there for the sake of religious purposes, rather than being components of their actual lives. However, as classics historian Stephen Bergman wrote in Handbook to Life in Ancient Mesopotamia, while we may casually refer to these tales as myths, to the ancient people of Mesopotamia they were as real as history itself, only shrouded in mist because of the remoteness of the times in which they took place. As for the gods and goddesses themselves, they were palpable realities, as real as the invisible forces that make plants and animals multiply, human beings yearn for love, and life come true. While gender transition, or at least nonconformity to what we see as traditional gendered appearances, might have been for the purpose of religion, it does not mean that it was not how these people lived their lives outside of rites and rituals. It seems that devotion to the pantheon of gods and goddesses, including Inanna, was ingrained and close to every aspect of day-to-day life. As established, Inanna was a goddess of constant contradiction and paradox, containing a sense of liminality, and a section from a hymn by Ashurbanipal, king of Assyria from around 668 to 627 BCE, to her Assyrian and Babylonian iteration, Ishtar, seems to provide another paradox in the seventh line. She has a beard like the god Ashur. There seem to have been similar references scattered in both Sumerian and later Near Eastern literary sources, with several key interpretations by historians of the Near East. Scholar of Semitic studies Morris Jastrow wrote an article in 1911 refuting the claims of historians before him that speculated that this was evidence that Inanna Ishtar was seen as quote-unquote bisexed. He attributed the references to the goddess having male features to a metaphor by the writers of the text of the planet Venus rising and setting, furthermore asserting that when it rose, it was seen as feminine, and when it set, it was seen as masculine, with the appearance of rays protruding from either side that produced a blurry image giving the semblance of a beard. The photograph is of Venus in the evening, and while it is from the central US in our present day, you can see the blurred sort of halo around it that Jastrow was referencing, and that the Mesopotamians would have seen as well. While Jastrow's points should not be disregarded, as his theory gives a viable explanation for Inanna's bearded iteration, he is flawed in his dismissal of this having anything to do with gender. In fact, he claimed that seeing Inanna Ishtar as possessing duality of gender was due to, in his words, a degeneratory process in religious beliefs. I posit that although it is likely that Sumerians, Assyrians, and Babylonians did use Inanna Ishtar as a representation of the planet Venus, they also saw her as having a masculine form. After all, she is the one who could turn a man into a woman and a woman into a man. Much of the evidence for the characteristics and lives of the Gala come from texts, although there have been a few visual and material sources found. One such finding is a statuette discovered between 1958 and 1964 in the archaeological dig site of Mari in present-day Tel Hariri, Syria. Although Mari was a Semitic city-state until its destruction around 1757 BCE, the people living there followed the Sumerian gods and rituals. Although as it was a trading center, there were other religions and cultures mixed in. The discovery was part of a larger dig project funded by the French government and was one of many Sumerian statuettes and fragments found. This one differed in the fact that there was debate within the dig report whether it depicted a man or a woman for several reasons. The inscription on the statuette states that this is Ur-Nanshe, a great singer to the goddess Inanna, but the writers of the dig report asked whether or not it would be more appropriate to read the name in a feminized way, Ur-Nina, considering its feminine aspects. They discussed the differences with other depictions of male Sumerians, such as the softened facial features of Ur-Nanshe, the long hair, the rounded, decidedly non-masculine chest, and the fringed dress, which were commonly associated with depictions of Sumerian women. Most likely, the person depicted by the statuette not only worked in a temple dedicated to Inanna, but was a Gala. The archaeologists write in the report that the missing fragment was almost certainly a harp, considering the position of Ur-Nanshe's arms, which would have been a main instrument of Galas. The section in the dig report about Ur-Nanshe does not end conclusively regarding their gender, which is understandable. There really is no way of knowing. However, I argue that it is clear that whoever this person was, they represented Inanna's trademark paradoxical qualities in their own androgyny. In addition to this, it seems that their gender nonconformance or transgender nature was at least partially accepted by their society, considering they had a statuette made of their personage. Another piece of tangible primary evidence that I would like to discuss is only a fragment of a whole, a shoulder and an arm with an inscription that reads, Silam Abzuda, hermaphrodite of Inanna. The rest of the statue was not or has not yet been found with the arm and the shoulder when they were excavated in 1926, but it can be assumed to be of a person who did not fit into our modern categories of man and woman. The inscription was translated from cuneiform into English by British philologist Dr. Irving Finkel, who used hermaphrodite in place of the literal translation. In a report by Julian E. Reed, in which he categorizes Sumerian statues that are housed in the archives of the British Museum, as these fragments in question are, he writes that the original inscription reads, Silam Abzuta Lu Sal Inanake, Silam Abzuta, person, man, woman of Inanna. The ancient Sumerians did not have the word hermaphrodite in their vocabulary, at least as far as we know right now. So while it is possible that this was an intersex person, it is also possible that they could have been gender nonconforming or any other variation on a gender not rooted in the binary. There could be an argument made, and has been in Assyrian scholarship, such as on the statues of Ur-Nanshe and Silam Abzuta, that all of the components related to Inanna that have to do with gender are simply a matter of the ancient Sumerians finding a way to describe intersex individuals. While people who were intersex probably lived and existed in Sumer, the language describing gender in relation to Inanna all seems to be focused on a transformation, and this rings truer to the experiences of transgender people. Thank you.
Great job. All right. Natalie, do you want to yield some questions?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, Matthew.
So I was wondering if you could talk just a little bit about the ways in which ancient Sumer kind of constructed gender as a conflict. What were the roles and expectations assigned to men and women, like using this binary framework?
So that's one thing that I was kind of struggling with, because there's not like a lot known, and the way that I was framing this was very much like stereotypically in our kind of modern conceptions of male and female. So female being like more smooth and like kind of delicate, and then male being like the opposite of that. There wasn't, I wouldn't say there was like gender equality, but it was egalitarian in a way, like everyone had kind of their own role, and it wasn't, there was, sorry, I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this. So like if a man had a certain role, for example, farming, they were considered, in that, and the woman had the certain role of either working in the temple or tending the house, they had that, but it was seen on an equal kind of level rather than that the housekeeping being on a lower level than the farming, if that makes sense.
Additional questions?
Yeah, Professor Dolly.
Again, I really enjoyed hearing the presentation of the paper that I have read, and your ongoing thinking about these issues. And I guess this is my question is somewhat methodological, and I don't know what sort of answer you might have to it. So, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So right, we can find evidence in a lot of different societies around the world where deities are not one gender, or at least they merge, right, with different gendered aspects. There's clearly Inanna, as you've discussed here. I think in Hindu religion, there are a lot of deities that have male avatars and female avatars. In Asian Buddhism, there's this deity that originally Avalokiteshvara, who was, I think, male in the Indian setting, but in East Asia became female, Guanyin. So right, there are these examples of deities taking on particular, or being given particular features of gender fluidity. And so my question, finally, is, as a historian, how do we analyze this evidence in order to understand what the society's views of gender were? And I mean, it is a vague and big question that is, I don't have an answer to myself, but it's sort of asking you as a historian, how do you, on what basis do you make your interpretation or analysis of the evidence?
I think that ideally I would look at how was gender viewed in this ancient society, and then what are more modern conceptions of gender. And one of the things I cut out of the presentation that was in the paper was I used Joan Scott's definition of gender as kind of my basis, that like it kind of has to relate to whatever cultural context is going on. But with Sumer, like there wasn't, or at least I didn't really find substantial discussion on what gender was. So ideally it would be this, but I'm not saying anything like firmly, like, yes, this was, you know, they were transgender. It's just kind of a suggestion.
That's part of the excitement, though, and the interest of the topic is that, well, okay, you don't have a lot of evidence, so there's a lot of room for interpretation. And as you said at the beginning of your answer, right, history is actually, in some ways, a conversation between the present and the past, right? We are using, as historians, our own lenses while trying to be as faithful to the evidence that we have as possible, even if that evidence is, in this case, quite literally fragmentary.
Yeah, there was a lot when I was reading sources, they would talk about primary evidence, but then I just couldn't find anything, any pictures, any discussion of it on the internet. And I think a big reason is that there's a lot of stuff in cuneiform that just either hasn't been translated or hasn't been digitized yet. Like all the fragments that were in the British Museum archives, like there were no pictures of it. Yeah, Professor Hill.
Thank you.
Did Keegan, you want to go first, or?
I have no preference.
Okay, then I'll just jump. Natalie, I couldn't quite tell from what your opening comments, and you mentioned a few historians along the way, scholars. Is this issue that you're sort of taking up in this? First of all, I enjoyed it a lot. I thought it was really terrific. Is this issue a live debate currently in those who study ancient Sumer? Or were you just alluding to sort of a larger historiographical question about whether trans exists in history in these sort of ancient civilizations? My next, just a related question to that, whether it's, because you make a compelling evidence why it's sort of ripe for discussion at the very least, right? I like it a lot in that way. My next question is would the, like, let's say you come to the conclusion, as you have, that trans identity or some version of that existed, right? Is that a conclusion, or should that be a starting point to then reinterpret some other element or elements of Sumer society and civilization? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So to the first section, the first question, most of the discussion on kind of the ambiguousness surrounding gender with Inanna and her followers were from like the 10s and the 20s with the Renanche, like from the 50s. And then one person that I cited, Will Roscoe, has a lot of, wrote a lot of articles about not just galas, but kind of gender nonconformity of followers of certain goddesses, and that was from the 90s. But I really haven't found a lot of discussion on this, especially in more modern kind of times, which also made me a lot more interested in this. So a lot of other people that I cited, it was just kind of, they weren't talking specifically about this, they're just of components. And then, sorry, could you repeat the second question?
Well, the second question was just, is the assertion of the trans identity a conclusion in itself, or should that be, in a sense, a launching point or starting point for a reinterpretation of various other elements of ancient Sumer?
Yeah, I definitely don't think this is a conclusion. I think it should be more of like a launching off point for more discussion, because I think there's a lot more that either hasn't been found or hasn't really been, or has been found and hasn't really been analyzed as much. So yeah, it's more of a starting off point. Yeah, Matthew.
First off, terrific presentation. I give you props for choosing an ancient topic during the time of COVID when research is very difficult. And my question is just, you mentioned how there's not a whole lot of documentary evidence available freely online, and you had to use a lot of material history. I was hoping you could like walk us through just very minorly what your research process was like. Like how did you narrow down what resources you were going to use, and how did you find this? Because like I felt like it was hard to find sources for me, and I'm doing a modern topic where like most of my primary sources were available online. I can't imagine doing what you did.
So I found, like, over the summer, I wanted to do something in relation to like ancient Sumer, like gods and goddesses. But then I found this one blog post from 2017 on Notches, which is like an LGBT history sort of blog. And it was about this. It was about like possible gender like transition. And I went to like all the sources that the author used and used those. And in the comments of that, there were several Sumerian scholars that were talking about this topic. So I found them on like the academia like website where you can search their, I forget what the dot whatever is, but where you can search their articles, or I searched the sources that what this original author cited. And that's how I found a lot of my sources. I also just like checked out, got books sent for me from the Gaucho Library on like Mesopotamia, and then went to whatever sources they were using and used them. Not a lot really showed up if I would just Google or like put into JSTOR like transgender and Sumer. So it was a lot of going into other people's sources and then finding more sources through them. And then Keegan, you had a question.
Yes. My question is the big thing I thought throughout this presentation is I thought of how you could help to contextualize your argument, because like obviously this is really ancient stuff. We're going to be very limited in what we have on this. So my thought is just like, have you thought about like contextualizing it in terms of just like using other religions to draw from to help bolster your argument? Because the thing I thought of throughout this whole presentation was Terces the Theban from Greek mythology. That's who really came to mind to me, and I just couldn't stop thinking of him all throughout this presentation. So my thought was just like using different religions to help contextualize your argument and ancient Sumer.
Yeah, I did that in my paper and I had to cut it out, unfortunately, for the presentation. But like the Hijra in India, like what Professor Dolly was referencing earlier, and there were also a cult called Gali with no linguistic like connection to Gauls, which I thought was interesting in Anatolia, like ancient Anatolia and ancient Greece, that were very similar to Gala in a lot of ways. So I would like ideally put this in context with other sort of, is a bad word to use for it, but like gender fluid like deities. But yeah, I think you're right.
Excellent. All right. Any other questions? All right. Great job, Natalie. Thank you so much. It's really
Thank you.
wonderful. Good job.